It's a great pleasure for me this evening to introduce and welcome a dear friend of mine, Saskia Sassen, who will speak this evening on the theme here, Expulsions, Complexity and Brutality in the Global Political Economy, the title of a new book of hers, which will be published, I gather, in May this year. Saskia is a professor of sociology at Columbia University and also a centennial visiting professor at the London School of Economics, where I met Saskia for the first time. Saskia is a sociologist renowned for her work in urban sociology on a whole range of themes. I'll just mention three: globalization and international human migration, the impact of globalization on the restructuring of economies, the influence of communication technology on governance. She has written an awful lot, and among the books that I was going to mention are The Global City, which is a standard book on many reading lists, first published in 1991, The Mobility of Labor and Capital, Cities in a World Economy, Losing Control, Sovereignty in an Age of Globalization, and now this book as well. But Saskia also very kindly has come here with a whole treasure trove of her books to give to the library. So we have a Sociology of Globalization, Territory, Authority, Rights, which is a classic study as well, The Mobility of Labor and Capital, Cities in the World Economy. They are not for sale. We're not trying to get you to buy them. They will go into the college library later. So Saskia, I should just say, has received, of course, many honors and awards and recognition of her outstanding work and the wide influence of her research and writing. So I think that's all I need to say. If you go to Wikipedia, you will find a formidable array of publications, articles, and so on, longer than I need introduced now. So please join with me in giving Saskia a very warm welcome.
Well, it's an enormous pleasure to be here. I'm just delighted that I got this invitation from David. I got to know him at the LSE, and this is such a different setting from the LSE. I think it's healthy for everybody to spend a bit of time in this grandeur. One thing that has intrigued me the most, David, is how warm you keep this space with such tall ceilings. So I imagine that there is some electronic ceiling, you know, at a certain height, so that you sort of compress all the heat down here. I want to talk about this project that I've been working on for the last 4 or 5 years, and the title sort of gives you the idea of it. There are two organizing propositions in this work. One of them is this notion that at some point the language of more inequality, more poverty, more etc., is not enough. We're on the other side of the curve. We need a new analytics. And so I argue that over the last 20 years, this need for a new analytics has emerged. And simply to keep on saying more of the same is not enough. So I use this notion of expulsions, which is different from social exclusion. It really is not even a cousin of that. Social exclusion happens inside a system. Expulsions, I argue, is a move across, a multiplication of systemic edges, nothing to do with borders. So right there in downtown London, you have systemic edges. So when it crosses one of these systemic edges, a process, whether there is more poverty, more inequality, more whatevers, it actually is a different story. And secondly, it becomes conceptually invisible. The systemic edge is an edge that renders the condition conceptually invisible. We may know that it is there, but we lack, I argue, the concepts to capture that crossing of a systemic edge. So it's like in the shadows of master categories. Master categories here including poverty, etc., all that kind of language. The second, and I want to talk mostly about that here, these systemic edges and the kinds of expulsions that happen. The second organizing proposition in this book is sort of an inquiry, really, into how do we capture the DNA of our epoch? Can we really keep on using the same language to capture where we're at? And I argue that we are still, in a way, captives of the language of the interstate system, even when we're talking about globalization. So when something happens in China, the categories for meaning that we trot out have to do with Chinese genealogies of meaning. Communism, the this or that. When something happens in the United States, it has to do with what we trot out as categories of meaning is something that has to do with the history of the United States. I do not deny that those histories matter. They're part of the story. But I think also there, we need something else. And so there's something else, and it's a bit of an experimental something else. It's the notion that, what if all these specific manifestations that take place in the interiority of the national, in economic issues, in political issues, etc., are actually the materializations, often in very thick forms, and thereby easily confused with saying, oh, that is China and communism, or that is, etc. What if they are, I repeat, the surface manifestations, the materializations of deeper trends that cut across these familiar divisions? Divisions that, I repeat, produce the categories for meaning. Now, these deeper trends, which I refer to as conceptually subterranean, it's not that they are beneath the ground, it's that we don't have the concepts to see them. See them in the sort of the sense, the Greek sense of theoria. Theoria in the Greek is seeing, so it's seeing with a conceptual eye. So I take, for instance, as examples, highly destructive types of mining. I have a whole bunch of case studies, and one of these is in Norilsk, in Russia, a place that started out as a gulag. So it has a real deep genealogy of communist meanings, and then winds up today being the biggest nickel-producing factory, mining operation in the world, and extremely destructive of people's health, of water, of land, of air in that area. And then I look at the gold mines in Nevada, incredibly destructive. And I say, why think, oh, it starts as a gulag, that's a communist story, and the mining, it's a business that tries to avoid all regulations, etc., etc. What if the facts on the ground, the misuse of people, the misuse of technologies, the will to destroy in order to get whatever you want to get, what if that is what counts? And so I look at I have about, a whole variety of instances, dealing with finance, dealing with land grabs, dealing with the whole sort of environmental question. And I stand back and I say, what if these facts on the ground that recur across the world, but in each case get constituted through the thick realities of that particular place and its histories, and hence are confusing conceptually speaking. But what if that is really the DNA of this epoch, much more than the much talked about, for instance, the high growth of China and the this and the that? That also matters, it is there, it's a fact. But what if there is a whole other conceptual space within which our current epoch is expressing itself, materializing in visible shapes, but that we still do not see conceptually, I repeat, because we trot out those familiar meanings. So it's communism, it's Russia, it's history, etc. So that second set of issues that I examine in this book, I'm not going to be able to address because I do only one. And so I'll do the one that is the simpler one in a way, which are these expulsions, because there I can show you some numbers, some figures, it's just easier to talk about than that more conceptual. But the conceptual does matter. And the empirics that I want to talk about here are actually constitutive of that second larger argument. Now, to do the kind of work that I do, and I have understood expose, I didn't start out that way, that I need a bit of freedom, operational freedom when I do my research, when I do my kind of work. So I call that space, the space before method. Now clearly this harkens back to Kafka's Before the Law. Before the law is a space where you're either terrified because the law is going to come down and chop off your head, or it is a space of what we might think, this is not what the language that Kafka used, the space of epistemic indignation. Not the kind of indignation where you're beating your chest, right? No, it's a mental, you experience the mental violence of an explanation that you don't accept, that you think is faulty, that doesn't work. And so I realized, again, expose, that I've been doing this for a very long time, since the beginning probably. I was such a migrant, such a nomad, that no existing paradigmatic situation at a given university in a given could fully capture me. So, and that probably explains, and I brought the book, my first book, which is now, a very respected book, got rejected, I don't know if I ever told you the story, by 12 publishers. You know what that is? You sent out one copy, you respect all the rules of the game. No. Then you violate a bit, 2 copies. No. Then I violated all the rules of the game, sent out 7 copies. No. And then a few more. And then finally, the 13th, Cambridge University Press said yes. I brought that book, The Mobility of Labor and Capital. Now, and of course, I believed in my work. I didn't change a thing. And so expose, I realized that I've always needed sort of a space of freedom before I throw myself into the disciplining of method, which you cannot avoid as a social scientist. Sometimes, you've got to deal with it. But and the practices that come, that I sort of develop in that zone, that one language that one can use to refer to them is analytic tactics. In other words, something that has to do with the freedom to position yourself vis-à-vis your object of study in whatever way you want, you need. And I really have been doing that. And it's not that I recommend it, because I never tell this to my doctoral students because it could be disastrous in the result. But anyhow, that is where we are. So a crucial element in that before method space for me is capturing the making of a condition, the making of histories, the making of injustice, the making of justice, the making. Now, that emphasis on making is partial. You are just capturing one moment, but it is a moment that often gets lost in a lot of conceptualizing, where the emphasis is on the condition that you capture, with the state, the economy, that kind of stuff. And some other ones are, and this is what I want to sort of exercise a bit today here, the active destabilizing of stabilized meanings. Now that has a kind of a time-space disciplining. So I argue that in the last 20 years, in a way the last 30 years in some parts of the world, we have really seen sort of an instability in fairly established conditions. What does it mean to say national economy in the last 2 decades and today? The national state, those are unstable meanings. Now, no meaning is permanently stable, but a powerful meaning can acquire a kind of stability. So speaking about the national state actually worked for about 100 years. Today, the state is there. It is designated as national. But what does it mean? What does market economy mean today when a few firms can control their markets? Yes, we do have a market economy, but it's an unstable meaning. That is sort of the idea. The second one, which to me is extremely important, is the question of powerful categories. Powerful categories I think of as collective productions. They have stood the test of time. They are powerful. You can't just throw them out of the window. But because they're so powerful, they're also limiting on some level. So one image that I have is, what don't I see? And again, see here is this ambiguous term. Theoria is also seeing. What don't I see when I use one of these powerful categories? So I'll develop that a bit too. And the notion here, just to sort of to make it clear to maybe some of you who might not understand, think of a sharp circle of light in a dark street. The stronger the light in that circle, the more you can see everything in it, but also the more difficult it is to see what lies in the penumbra around that circle of light. And I realized, like, even when I was doing my work, the mobility of labor and capital, I didn't say the mobility of capital and labor. I said the mobility of labor and capital. What do I see when I emphasize labor? I was really dealing with international migrations, but beginning in the 1800s, etc. And the global city. The city supposedly was in a hierarchy of, you know, the national, what do I unsettle when I bring global into something that is meant to be a local element? And so, you know, there's a whole series. You can, it's like almost like a little exercise here. Now, the final one is something that I'm working on now that I finished the book, which I just finished on Friday, so I'm a bit of a wreck. And it is, again, going back to something that I have really worked on for the last 10 years, which is territory. And I argue that territory, powerful category. Territory is not just land, it's not terrain, it's not ground. It is a collective production with embedded logics of power and embedded logics of claim-making. Historically, in our modernity, it has had a land element, a land function. But what happens when we push that category to work analytically, to wake up from that long analytic siesta it has had in the last 150 years, when it had a single meaning, national sovereign territory. When something has a single meaning, it's not working analytically. It's just sitting there, full of meaning, full of contents, but it's not working analytically because it has a single meaning. So what I want to do is to wake it up. And so if you want an organizing, you can barely call it proposition, it's more like an organizing provocation. I want to look at the conditions under which territory becomes nomadic. And so, for instance, I argue that if you look at national territory today in familiar countries that we are familiar with, you can actually detect sort of structural holes, holes, H-O, in the tissue of national sovereign territory. Something else is happening in the interiority of national sovereign territory. It does not override national sovereignty. The interstate system is here to stay for quite a bit more, I think, but something is unstable in terms of this category, national sovereign territory. So those are sort of examples. Anyhow, I'm not going to get to that, but this is where my head is right now sort of obsessing. Now, I like curves. Curves, lines that have a shape. And I sort of, for instance, this line could also be translated into multiple numbers and you wouldn't get a sense at all. This, my hope is, my illusion, my fantasy, that you look at it and in 1 second, you have a narrative. And so the narrative that interests me here, is this work? Can you see the beamer? Can you see the red spot? Okay. So look at this. So stability used to start in the 1940s. It's a bit above zero. You can't tell from here. 1970 slight increase. By the way, I'm sorry. Corporate profits after tax. And then comes 1985, 1990, and look what begins to happen. And those of you who know my work a bit know that I consider this a very critical period. And then it goes up. This is the crisis, which for this category, corporate profits, unlike your average worker, lasted for about half an hour. I exaggerate, but more like a year and a half, and then it goes up. It's like something happened in the crisis, including bank bailouts and stuff like that, that actually allowed the profit to move down, while unemployment continues to be. So anyhow, what I want to point out is, and I'm going to show you a few, this changing shape, that here the numbers actually tell a story. And so here is another one. This is beautiful. The story itself is horrible, of course. But here again, 1965, 1990, 1980, there it goes up. This is corporate assets in the United States, which reach a higher level than GDP in the United States. This is different. This was more messy to put in a curve. And here, the parallel history one is that central governments also had a growth curve, but it was mostly debt. And so here are a few just examples, right? 1980, 2010. Also Germany, by the way, 13%, 44%. The United States, number 1, 25 to 61, etc. So you have two very sharp trends happening, and it means an impoverishment of national governments. Many of our national governments today could not do what they did, in the 50s, in the 60s, build massive new infrastructures, etc. These are, to me, significant trends that mark the transformation. And here you have, this is a very interesting graph, also ratio of 1% wealth to median wealth from 1962 to 2010. So there it goes, it bobs along, etc., etc. By the 2000s, it is really going sharp. Capture at the top. You have a lot of that. To me, that again, that marks something epochal about these last 2 decades. Here's another version of that. Share of total wealth. The mic, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's all right. So, but you could all hear me. It's just for the video, huh? Anyhow, so this is share of total wealth gain, 1983 to 2010. Look at this. The lower end loses. Mind you, at a period that saw enormous making of wealth. And then when you get to the 80s, the 90th percentile, ooh, look at this. So these are very significant trends. Now, I have illustrated this mostly with the United States, which is probably the extreme version of everything that is not so good in our sort of semi-prosperous and so-called developed economies. Oopsie. Now here I have a lot of stuff on the internally displaced populations. This also grows. And in fact, after this, it goes even, look at this, so it keeps growing. But this is a very sharp growth curve, just in the 2000s. And I also look, for instance, I don't have that graph here, at prisons. The rise of private prisons and prisons, that also grows. So you see a lot of trends that in a way mark an instability in the existing system that we have, what we still think of maybe as a Keynesian period of the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. By the time we reach the 90s, something has changed. So this is another example for me of expulsions. Again, these are just elements. Vulture funds, I'm sure that many of you know what these vulture funds are. What I'm trying to get at here, and I'll give you an example in a second, is that what the vulture funds that really emerge in the 1980s, I assume that some of you at least know vulture funds they didn't call themselves vulture funds, they were referred to as vulture funds. They took pride in making profits out of semi-dead operations, possibilities, governments in terms of debt in this case. So the reason I think of it as an expulsion, and it's just one of several that concern the state, is that it actually expels national sovereign states from a kind of international space that carried with it a certain type of protection. You did not go and take a national state to court in a civil commercial court. You didn't do that. You know, the IMF handled it a bit, etc. So what happens, and here's the concrete example, and it really is worth just reading through the details. And so Elliott Fund, so I tracked a lot of the operations that they did. So let me just read it aloud. So that on October 95, this New York Vulture Fund buys $28.7 million of Panama debt for a discounted value from another bank, from other banks. The reason this debt was discounted is because those banks thought they were never going to get it back. But they, unlike Elliott, accepted that fact, because that was sort of international, you know, the comity, if you want, not committee. It's sort of a mutual respect among states. You didn't do that. So in July 96, that Vulture Fund brings suit against the US court, against the Panama government for full payment. Now, what I want to emphasize is this was an innovation. There was nothing in international law that prevented firms from taking a sovereign government into just a regular court. But it just wasn't done. This is sort of part of treaty law. These are not all explicated rules of the game. So this, in a way, is an innovation. It's a brutal one. And they win against Panama's government for full payment of debt plus interest. They got the court to approve and force the Panamanian government to pay $57 million. You understand what happened here? The other banks, you know, good or bad banks, I don't know, it doesn't matter. They said, okay, we have this loss, we discount our debt, let's see what happens. These guys go, start a whole other circuit, and win well. And then that same fund, same story, other governments march, about 27 million from Peru. I mean, here's a list of countries that this fund alone, I mean, mind you, there were other funds. Ecuador, Ivory, Poland, Congo, Vietnam, Canada, Netherlands. I mean, it's just extraordinary. So that gives you also a sense. This is just a micro little history, if you want, that alters something. And again, for me, it crosses one of these systemic edges. So when I use the language of expulsions, I'm not just talking about the unemployed and the incarcerated. I'm also talking about far more complex arrangements. And part of the story for me is precisely how complex forms of knowledge that we respect and admire can produce rather simple brutalities. That's sort of the concept in this book. Now, I just gave you a few items, right, that mark transformations, ruptures of some sort or another. So one sort of way in which you can frame all of this is to ask, you know, what's the steam engine of our epoch? And that is another way of asking, what's the DNA? What is the thing that doesn't account for everything, but that has a shaping impact, direct, indirect, to the point that we lose track of how that final outcome might be linked to some elementary or first condition. It may not be elementary at all. And so I think that finance is a top candidate for this. It's not the only one, but it is part of the steam engine of our epoch. Now, I think of finance as radically different from banking, traditional banking, and people often confuse, and the banks themselves, many of them are actually financial firms, or they are called banks, are not so keen either on emphasizing the difference. So I think of finance as a capability. Traditional banks sell something they have, money they have. So, you know, they make money, they make a profit on interest. Finance sells something it does not have. And in that selling, what it does not have lies its creativity and its danger. You know, it's dangerous. So, in a way, you can think of finance as confronting a major challenge, right? So, for instance, when you think about derivatives, very efficient tool to do this. It's the mathematics of physicists. It's not the mathematics of microeconomics. It has nothing to do with microeconomics. Microeconomics is a closed system, and you sort of, you know, manipulate this and that. Finance is more the mathematics of tracking what you cannot really know. So it's brilliant, innovative. At one point, in the height of this period in the 1990s, the back room of Goldman Sachs, back room being something that you refer to as where the secretaries sit, had 100+ physicists. Now, I really like physicists, and what happened here was that once they are turned 30 or so, many of them do not know what to do with themselves, and they wind up in all kinds of sort of really interesting situations. So brilliant, complex forms of knowledge. And the second feature is that it needs to invade other sectors, because it sells something it does not have. So that brilliant innovative capacity is deployed so that you can financialize everything, you know, from very fancy stuff to used car loans, student loans, because you aggregate millions and you're going to make something out of it. So in that sense, I argue that that is again in the shadow of powerful explanations. When I say finance, people mix it up with banking, etc., and there you are in the familiar, you know. When I say finance in that way, what don't I see? What I don't see is that finance is not banking, and that finance should be thought of as a capability. We monetize what it generates because that's the only way we can think of it. It certainly makes money, but at the heart of finance, banking also makes money. At the heart of finance is a capability that far surpasses the capability of banking. So look at this. This just illustrates a capability. So these are credit default swaps. Whether you know what that is or not doesn't really matter. Look at this short, brutal history. Less than $1 trillion in 2001, 62 trillion by 2007. Think of anything that has that capacity to make value in such a short period of time. Very few things. I can think of a single one. Now, mind you, 62 trillion in 2007 was more than global GDP, but that's easy for finance, you know, especially since we're using money where who knows what it is exactly. But this, furthermore, was about 10% of global value of financial assets as measured by outstanding derivatives, which at that point was 630 trillion. And in 2011, the global value of finance, as measured by outstanding derivatives, was over $1 quadrillion. Now, again, this is not money. There is no, that money doesn't exist. It exists, maybe 62 trillion do somewhere exist, but not $1 quadrillion. In that sense, really the importance of thinking of it as a capability. Now, just to get to the point of expulsions here very quickly and sort of quick lateral move, I was interested in decoding how very modest values can work brilliantly for finance, even as they destroy whole neighborhoods. Because that is also an interesting juxtaposition. In many ways, the corporations, they may destroy the environment, but they have to sell something that people want to eat or drink or ride on or whatever. This actually creates the challenge, the complexity of the derivative. At its heart is the capacity to de-link the actual value of whatever it is that you're going to invade or financialize from profit in the high finance, the high investment circuit. That is the complexity. And so the extreme case for me was the subprime mortgage, you know, because you're dealing with very modest little houses. This is the United States. By now, I'll show you some figures. It has spread to Europe with not nice outcomes. So the key here is that the source of profits for financial firms of the subprime and other types of sort of mortgages for low and modest income household is not payment on the mortgage. That doesn't matter. The challenge was, and a colleague of mine, Patrick Bolton, just a brilliant French economist at Columbia University, I asked him, okay, show me all these steps, because he was also doing research on this. he showed it's either 15 or 16 steps. You take that little low value, you want to generate a contract that delinks, and it takes 15 to 16 complex steps. So in other words, enormously complex forms of knowledge that have as an outcome a simple brutality. It is not even a grand brutality. When you build a huge dam, you have very complex forms of knowledge, and you have a grand brutal outcome. You know, you disappear villages, you flood, whatever. You understand what I'm talking about. This is a very simple little brutality. And sort of in the book a bit, I'm interested in that juxtaposition, you know, that enormously complex forms of knowledge to produce at the end some very simple brutality. I mean, there are also some very complex brutalities. So the source of profits, by now I assume you have read this, the source of profits is the bundling of a large number of these mortgages to sell onto the investors, the highest circuit, etc. Now, here's the outcome. So in a short, brutal history, you know, in 201, 202, when this starts, it was more or less very modest, you know, they were trying it out. By 206, they were selling millions. From 205 or so till 2012, 15 million of these contracts were signed. Now, of those 13 million, some of these still have to come. The story will end by the end of 2015 because these contracts were set 5 years, you sign, all they asked people was sign. Whether they could pay or not didn't matter, because we were dealing mostly with very modest households. 70% of households in the United States own their house. So we were dealing with the poor, those who thought, I'm never going to own a house. So all they asked, just sign. So those people may have put whatever little stuff they had and then lost that too. Now, I hope that you're still with me because I went quickly over this. One could spend an hour talking about this, but I don't want to do that. Anyhow, foreclosure is not necessarily that you're out of your house. Of these 13 million foreclosures, but, you know, between 26 and 2010, 9.2 million, according to the central bank, the Federal Reserve, they have, you know, their data gathering operations besides bailouts and stuff like that. 9.2 million were thrown out of their houses. Now, I want to make a footnote here and say that this is an amazingly material history, you understand? This is chock full of materialities. A household can be one person, 2, 3. So the estimate is that it's about 30 million people who are affected in this process, the 9.2 million households. It is invisible. That's also an accomplishment. In its full materiality, it remains invisible. So we now have thousands of people living in tent cities, the same little tents as the international refugee system, and in the surroundings outside of nice municipal governments who offer those tents, nobody goes there. It's invisible. We have whole neighborhoods empty. Nobody goes there. So I find that as a social scientist also very interesting. It may be super material. It does not mean that it is visible to our conceptual eye or to whatever, to our eye, also the basic eye. Now, and by the way, when you think about 30 million people, I'm Dutch. The Netherlands has about 16 million people. It's like some god, a voice from upstairs saying, okay, all of you on the Dutch territory of the Netherlands, out. And then we're going to repeat the exercise, ladies and gentlemen, out again. That is what that is. So it is, to me, it's the awesomeness also of the materiality of it. Anyhow, so these are the figures for Europe. And I mean, I have the full list of all the EU 20, the European, the 27 countries, but so here are the highest foreclosures. Foreclosure does not necessarily mean that you're out, but in Hungary we know, because this is a story that goes on and that begins, we have about 1 million foreclosures now, and many of these people are out. So Hungary is high, Germany is high, Spain is high, United Kingdom is high. The lowest foreclosures, Bulgaria, Finland, Denmark, the Netherlands, but also there you have it. Now this is an instrument, this is finance as a capability. You can deploy it anywhere. So I am also very interested, what's the global space for this instrument? When you and so I looked, I should first say before I do that I'm sort of very interested in seeing debt as a bridge. Debt is a bridge that connects all kinds of people to finance and also to regular banks, by the way. So this is from IMF staff papers. And so read the title of this, Ratio of Household Credit to Personal Disposable Income. Now, credit sounds very nice. It is debt. And debt means that the bank has built a bridge to you and your household, right? Now, look at some of these figures. And this, again, is a very short and brutal history. I see, the 1990s consolidates a new set of alignments of power and lack of power, etc. And the 2000s instantiates that in a variety, including these very modest setups here. So look at debt. So take Hungary. In 2000, 11%, in other words, of personal disposable income in the household. It winds up being 39% only 5 years later. Now, the United States was already number one, at 104% already then, and 132% at 205. Germany, amazing, 70, 70, 70, 70, 70, 70. They didn't budge. I don't know how they did that. But, you have Spain, look, you can see the undoing, 65 up to 112. That's almost a doubling. Now, one critical question when you think of a system, even if it is a little system like the city where you live, who owns that household debt? If a little local bank owns that debt, then you might say that the interest payments of that household, of that individual, recirculate, and have a growth function. That is why, banks are fine. We need banks. We also need finance. But the problem is when finance gets out of control because it cannot govern its own power. So I ask myself, who owns this debt? I repeat. And again, the IMF has all kinds of data. And just to stick with Hungary, 40% of that household debt is owned by foreign banks. German, Austrian, Swiss, mostly. There is data for every one of these countries, I just can. So that is not good, because chances are that doesn't stay in Hungary. Who knows where that goes? So that's not a good symptom. Now, the other end of this is something some of you must have heard, because London is a key site, the super prime housing market. Another invention. The subprime mortgage is an invention. It's a very powerful one. When it was in the hands of the state, when it was a state project to provide housing, it was great. When it becomes a financial project, it's not about providing housing to low-income people. It's something else. It's to create something, an asset-backed security for the high investment circuit. This is also an invented market. Now here, here you see a few figures. Those are minimum prices. Huh? So the minimum price, if you get your property, this is all housing. Huh? It also exists for offices, but this table is about housing. If you get it in there, you get that artificially high prices. Now I know for a fact the basic price going in London is, what is London? It's not 15 million, it's 100 million. Same thing in New York. None of those properties is worth 100 million. Not one of them. It is an invented market. Now, what do we have? We have capture at the top of profits, of earnings, etc. There is so much money that the ones who invented this market, the same thing with black pools in finance, those are invented markets. They know that these people don't know what to do with their money. Now, when I see this kind of stuff, I ask myself, what am I not seeing when I use this language? And it seems to me what is really happening here, it's the buying of urban land. How do you buy urban land? You can't just go buy urban land. Urban land has an intermediation, and it's buildings typically, or something like that, or a sports stadium. This is about buying land. And if you look, there was a great story, just came out in the Guardian, I don't know if anybody saw it. Most of those properties, these very fancy mansions, the Mac mansions there, and they're empty. They're falling apart on the interior. Nobody cares, nobody lives there. So this is, again, a totally different kind of tale, but it is also some systemic edge is at work here. This is about urban land. When you invest like this, you are investing in something that is potentially liquid. Again, territory becomes nomadic. It changes. It's something else. Now, I have the whole list here, etc. There are some interesting comments to make, but I'm not going to dwell on it. Now, so linked to what I just showed about the superprime market are the so-called, gently called land grabs. I'm sure that term is familiar to many of you. What we are talking about is when governments and firms buy a significant piece of land in a foreign country. On some level, this is a very old history, right? It's the history of empire on some level. And many people like just the grand category, empire. I like it too. But when I put my research hat on, I want to understand the details. And coming back to that initial proposition, how is this made? This is made. This doesn't just fall from the sky, these acquisitions. At a time when, formally speaking, most land in the world is under the control, formally speaking, of a sovereign national state. It is actually not that simple to go buy 2.8 million hectares in some foreign country, especially if you're another government. So part of the story for me about this chapter in the book is the complexity of the contracts in order to execute a very simple operation, buying a huge piece of land. And so here again, I was very interested in sort of when does the curve change shape. And with these land acquisitions, I mean, again, this is an old, it has been happening, blah, blah, you know, but then in 2006, it just goes like that. Between 2006 and 2010, over 200 million hectares were bought by 15 countries and by 100 plus firms. We are only, this is a global network land matrix, some of you may know it, that is collecting the data, you know, in bits and it takes a vast amount of effort, toiling. And only properties that are more than, or acquisitions that are more than 200 hectares, otherwise, you know, you wind up. And so, I say in the shadows of urbanization because I want to, it's not just about documenting the stuff, but again, coming back to my analytic tactics. So I'm totally irritated by all these politicians who are saying, you know, most people in the world now live in cities and they never look at all that larger space, that larger assemblage of elements within which that growth of urban populations is happening. Now some of it is internal to the city, but some of it is, of course, we have millions of people who are being expelled from their little land plots. You know, if in 5 years 220 million hectares of land are bought to create huge plantations, to create whatever, you know, stuff like that, where do those people go? They go to cities. So this is the point here of in the shadows of urbanization. Now I wanted to show you very quickly, I mean, some of the implications here. You know, the land is more valued than the people or activities in it. You can say the same thing for the super prime housing market. You can say the same thing for the subprime housing market. There is something about a mobilizing of land, terrain, surface, territory, ground, space, whatever the terms. And again, that comes back for me to this notion of the nomadism, the institutional nomadism of territory, what we have sort of consolidated with one singular meaning. Now here are some very quick figures, and again the minimum is 200 hectares. So in Europe, where you have quite a bit of land acquisitions, but they are all very, they tend to be small, but when you take over 200, you can also see there that there is quite a bit of activity. And by the way, in Cambridgeshire, David, so I sort of got to talk with some big landowner there, you know, a farm, whatever. And he said that the Mormons of Utah, you know, in Utah, whatever, in the United States, they are buying land in Cambridgeshire. Cambridgeshire still has quite a bit of farmland. So it's happening right around the corner. So here are some of these numbers, right? You can see that, just look at the yellow columns, etc. These are the ways in which this was measured. But it's happening in the whole world. Now, I want to emphasize that when you look at who is buying, for instance, JP Morgan bought land in Ukraine, Goldman Sachs bought land in Russia, you know, there was one particular year, 2006 and 2007, when most land acquisitions in a particular area of Africa were hedge funds. So, you know, we talk about the creativity of finance. Now, when they buy land, it's not because they're going to be farmers. They make it liquid. The capacity to liquefy land, because land stands for water, for biofuels, for food, you know, but those three matter a lot, by the way. And then the other element I want to emphasize, for those of you who might be interested in this kind of stuff, that when you look at, people tend to think that most of the land is being bought for food. No. Biofuels, industrial crops. And that has an added consequence that is also sort of in the shadow of this whole process, which is that in areas of the, see, this is the yellow here is all biofuels, and especially in Africa and in Asia, it is mostly for biofuels. What does that mean? That means that they can put all the pesticides and all the poisons they want, which means that the whole area around, if you still have small farmers there, they can't use the land. And this is a big story in terms of palm and soy. It also then means that in areas of the world, like in Brazil and Argentina, where you used to have, you had poverty, but you never had hunger, because the people, the farm workers, they were growing something that they could eat. Black beans in Brazil. Well, now it's soy, sunflower seeds, palm. Guess what? You have hunger, you have poverty, and you have hunger. So it is a very peculiar, I would say, you know, arrangement here. Now I want to end with sort of a final kind of category, if you want, which again goes back to one of these analytic tactics about unstable meanings, and it is a question of membership in the nation state. Now, everything that I said clearly, and the citizen, if you want, you know, the carrier, the formalized subject that has standing vis-à-vis the state, vis-à-vis the law, and all the trends that I have described clearly destabilize the meaning of what it means to be a citizen. You know, in different situations, different. But there is one that I am now doing research for in my new little territory book, and it has to do with this. This is just one little map, and it shows 10,000 buildings. This is what we know. What we don't know is what we don't know, right? So 10,000 buildings that do full-time data gathering / surveillance. I mean, most of it is data gathering. They're not doing that much surveillance, really. And it's 7,000, again, this is what we know, 7,000 private firms involved, huh? And then 2,100. And just to give you, just to give you a sense, Washington, D.C. is, of course, a high point here. And so in Washington and the surrounding area, 33 building complexes for top secret intelligence work are under construction or have been built since September 2001. Together, they occupy 17 million square feet, which is the equivalent of almost 3 pentagons, or, this is really an irony, 22 US Capitol buildings, the Capitol being the house of democracy for the people. So this surveillance machinery or data gathering machinery is going to have a space that is 22 times the Capitol. Now back to this map. So here again, I'm intrigued by a bunch of things here. One of them is the materiality of this. Vast materiality, and yet it's invisible. A second kind of invisibility really runs through our conceptual, you know, sort of understanding of the world around us. So this is a map produced, it's in the public domain, and I've been showing this map since 2010 when it first came out. And only after Snowden did people actually, could they understand? I gave them the details, mind you, when I spoke. But it was too much it was just too much. I also checked with all kinds of people. Did you see the map? This was a series of 16, oh no, it was like six 6 different articles, etc., in the Washington Post. It was a one-year project. They used 16 of their top people, a massive. Most people, like political scientists, international, I mean, people they hadn't seen it. And this was just not, this was like a blank spot. They didn't think about this. So that in itself, to me, anthropologically speaking, sort of was really interesting. The other element that I want to emphasize is the 7,000 private firms. By now, by the way, we have more. The Utah building, or Utah, whatever it's called, is one of the biggest, and it was just completed. When this map came out, 2010, it was under construction. A lot of the stuff in Washington is now completed also. So it's huge, but it wasn't until Snowden, mind you, the WikiLeaks was a kind of dumping, Assange, so that didn't, but when Snowden, that suddenly, a totally different reaction when I would present this. Now, back to these 7,000 firms. So, we have about 1 million plus people with top secret clearance. Top secret clearance is really a big deal. It's not just that you have access to some secrets. It's a very exclusive domain. Most of them, for this operation, are employed in these private firms. When these private firms do what they do, they need a lot of top-level algorithm builders and all kinds of construction such as that. If your best algorithm builder is an Indonesian mathematician, you know what? Or a Russian, quite a few Russian, you recruit them. So what is happening is this world, this parallel world up there, which is adorably international. It's like denationalized. You have all kinds of nationalities up there. French, Russians, etc. And they, of course, are full-time gathering data. So my university, for instance, has full access to all my email, to all our acts of communication. This is under, we are under an emergency state. By the way, so is the UK. So is Germany. These are very partial national security provisions. But they allow, for instance, all of these governments to engage in unlawful detention, habeas corpus out of the window. So we have a very partial, almost invisible zone that when you cross into that zone, you disappear. There is a national security letter. I don't know if you have that in the UK. You get the letter. The letter tells you, if you're called by a judge, you cannot tell anybody, not your lawyer. You cannot tell anybody that you've got this letter. Hey, that's a systemic edge, and it's right there in the center of Manhattan or wherever it might be, right? So there is a lot of stuff happening. So I ask, here is this nice internationalized parallel world up there doing full-time data gathering, and then we are here, the citizens, we who are subject to more and more sort of constraints, etc. Now I feel fine, I'm not going to bother with it, but the vulnerable people, like Muslims in the United States, pre-trial solitary confinement up to 7 years, not a hearing with a judge, not a chance, habeas corpus completely. So this stuff is very invisible to most of us, but it's very real. Again, systemic edge in there. So the question, however, when I just take the more general element, the question really is, who are we, the citizens? If a very international set of people can be gathering all the data about us. They may not be interested at all in us. I'm not making this a personal, I'm just making this a systemic statement. It really does leave us with a question. Who are we? The nation-bound, national, whatever, citizens? I don't know. But it is clearly an unstable meaning. And to me, the one thing that I would sort of pull out of it is that it is a transversalizing of who we are. And it means that nationality, whether you're an immigrant, etc., should really be neutralized in the same way that it is neutralized up there. They are in a vanguard compared to where the debate on that other ground is happening. Immigrant, not too many, No, that's not where we are. So part of the DNA, again, of our epoch, is only partly captured by some of these older categories. Now, mind you, all of this that I have described here, and I have much more, of course, but there is no time, can comfortably coexist with the interstate system, with national bound citizenship, no problem at all. The problem is that those categories, that's sort of the circle of light, all the details, we know everything about it, even about this, we now know so much, right? But the question really does remain. What are we not seeing? Precisely because we have, even the Snowden, all the information is to me an invitation to rethink and say, what am I not seeing? What is the larger underlying DNA that is making shape? And this is my final sort of thought, so I come back to this notion of, these conceptually subterranean trends that when they instantiate, when they appear, we interpret them with categories of meaning that maybe are not totally up to the job. So I leave you with that very nice final thought. Thank you very much.